As Turkish people vote in what is dubbed as the most important election in recent years in the Republic of Turkey, and also an election that may have major impact on the future of this republic and the fate of incumbent President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. We as journalists normally interview analysts, official, and we are on the ground interviewing people. But this time I want to take you in a different direction. I would like to interview colleagues, journalists, and see their take hear their take on the elections and see how they have been covering the elections. I have with me here Esra Öztürk, a Turkish journalist, as well as my colleague Yasin Eken. Thank you so much for being with me. Yasin, I'd like to start with you. Talk to us about how different are these elections in Turkey from previous elections?
It's hard to say. Really, any question you ask me, I would define as really difficult. And I believe, or at least it's to my understanding, the reasoning behind that is these elections are probably the most difficult elections that at least I've witnessed over the last couple decades. The reasoning behind that is now we have two main parties, two main leaders that are running for office. And based on my social circle, which I like to believe I have a very diverse social circle, those who support Erdogan, for whatever reason, aren't necessarily voting for Erdogan with a clear conscience. And the same thing applies for the opposition leader as well. Both parties or both leaders, they have something to offer for the country, but they also have something that they dislike very much. So leading into these elections, the Turkish voter, for the most part, it's at odds with them. They're at odds with themselves. They're at odds with the leaders. And essentially what they want is they want a whole new political spectrum. They want different leaders. They want someone else. And essentially, when you take a look at the dynamics that are in place right now, we see, for example, Turkish president, the incumbent president Erdogan, who has a different approach to economic policies. He's more focused on, let's say, the midterm, the long-term goals, whereas the opposition is more concerned with fixing the short-term goals, ensuring people have some sort of economic stability, but not the same cannot necessarily be said for the midterm or long-term goals that they have in place. So the people have something to decide on. But the reality is, if they had a better option, there is a very high likelihood that none of them would be voted into office. Which is actually an interesting approach, which is why these elections are important, as were the previous ones. But based on the trajectory that we're going, I believe the next elections will be even more important, that they will be even more crucial. And potentially speaking, we could see a whole new political spectrum and a new future for the country.
That's very interesting. And Esra, I'd like to ask you a question about how different, assuming that President Erdogan loses the election, how different will be the coming administration under the opposition leader Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu in terms of foreign policy? How different will that be from incumbent Erdogan?
Recep Tayyip Erdogan is in power for more than 20 years, either as a prime minister or as a president, as he's right now. So from the starting, if we will look at his past, so he was much more approachable to the EU and the West. He was really trying hard to establish good relations with the US and the European countries. But by time, of course, Turkey is waiting at the doors of the European Union for more than 20 years, and the things have started to change naturally. After that, President Erdogan started to focus more on Asia, cooperations with Russia and Turkic states in Central Asia, and he tried to be a regional power in the Middle East, actually. So when we're looking at the campaigns of both presidential hopefuls, we said that, for example, yesterday, President Erdogan was in Hagia Sophia, which turned to a mosque from a museum. So he's just trying to actually give a message to the whole Muslim world and the countries in the Middle East who cares about Hagia Sophia as being a mosque and imposing a symbolic meaning to it. But when we look at Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu's foreign policies, so during his campaign, he was several times underlining that he will follow a foreign policy aligned with the US and the West. And he was promising his constituency that he's going to bring clean money from the West, and the amount is $300 billion. So this is a very big number, and still we don't know, we don't have any tangible facts in background, I mean behind the stages, which kind of meetings he has done with the Western countries or investors, whatever. But the thing is, just a few days ago, there was a very interesting development in Turkey. Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu tweeted about Russia. He said, "Dear Russian friends, please take your put hand back from the Turkish state." So it was something very discussed within Turkish politics, both in the opposition side and the ruling parties side. After that, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov made a statement that Russia is not interfering with Turkish elections at all, including the digital interference too. So after Peskov's statement, Kılıçdaroğlu gave another public speech, and he said, "Well, thank you, Russia. We accept what you say. So if this is the fact, and if you're not interfering with our elections, you are still our friends. We don't have any problem with Russian people," unquote. So the thing is, he's underlining always the West, the Western aligned foreign policy, the Western investment, the clean money from the West. So actually this shows which type of foreign policy will run in Turkey after he got the administration. Another thing, let me add this. So while I was speaking with his chief foreign policy aide last week, he told me that he believes immediately after the elections, Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu will have very good and cordial relations with Vladimir Putin. So it was a little bit contradictory to have both statements from chief foreign policy aide and the presidential candidate Kılıçdaroğlu. So still, we cannot figure out which way he will walk, but for sure he will try to come close with the West.
And that's an extremely interesting point, Esra and Yasin, because President Erdogan, the incumbent, provides stability and also an experience of more than 2 decades in office. How much, Yasin, did the message by the opposition leader resonate with the people? You've been on the ground, you speak to Turkish voters. Do they really care about foreign policy, or they're more interested in the internal domestic policies, especially the economy, as well as the immigrants here or the refugees here, I should say, in Turkey?
Good question. Speaking on my own behalf, I am a lot more concerned with respect to foreign policy. What are Turkey's relations with the countries that are neighboring it or those abroad? However, if you ask the average Turkish voter, they might have some sort of an understanding. They might even care for it, but there are more pressing matters, and they are domestic policies, the economy, purchasing power. And that's another argument that needs to be made as well. When we talk about the economy in Turkey, we don't necessarily define what we mean by the economy is bad. That's a very popular quote among many voters. The economy is terrible. But if you look at the statistics, the economy has been performing the best it ever has since Erdogan took power in the early 2000s. So we need to identify what's going right and what's going wrong. The Turkish economy is growing exponentially. This last year has been pretty rocky, but the purchasing power has been falling. So this is one of the main talking points for many of the Turkish voters, especially the young voters. And one of their main concerns, of course, they are domestic policies. Some of them may have some concern regarding foreign policies. But the common underlying theme seems to be, it doesn't matter whether it's Erdogan, whether it's Kılıçdaroğlu, whether it's Meral Akşener, Muharrem İnce, and these other names that I listed are either members of the opposition coalition, they were at one point running for office. The reality, or the one thing that remains the same and a constant, is the political figures that we have in place today were the same last year, the year before that, the year before that, and the year before that, right up until Erdogan was in office, even before that. So the general underlying theme is, it doesn't matter what happens after this point. We want to vote Erdogan out of office. We will have someone to replace him, and then when time comes around for the next elections, we will have an answer. And that answer is essentially the youth, the young population within the country, telling the whole wide world that we're done with these guys, we want something else, and we are going to do it.
That's very interesting because it's almost like, if I'm hearing you correctly, Yasin, as if that the more important election is the one that will be held in 5 years, in 2028, far more important than these elections, even though it's being dubbed historic and critical and significant. And speaking also, Esra, of young voters, 5 million new voters will be voting this time. Turkey is a young population republic country, and 60 million plus are voting today. The opposition united 6 opposition parties together to unseat Mr. Erdogan. So they are united on that issue. But assuming they take office, are they united on the other issues domestically and internationally, and focusing on the domestic part of it?
Actually, it's very difficult to say this, and there are really many concerns regarding how they're going to govern the countries, because there are 6 different, including Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. There are 6 leaders in this United 6. So the interesting is, first time in Turkish history, there will be 7 deputy presidents, including the mayors of Ankara and Istanbul, and they were promised to be given the post of deputy presidency. So the public on ruling parties coalition, their supporters are discussing that how they're going to manage all of these policies, how they're going to meet in a common sense while making up this policy. Let it be foreign policy or domestic policy. So this is a very big question, actually, and we still don't know the answer, because now when we look at the parties within this United 6, and the ruling parties coalition calls them United 7 because they include the PKK affiliate, allegedly PKK affiliated HDP2, so they call it the table of this 7. And it's really big question. On the one hand, you have previous Turkish Prime Minister Erbakan's legacy Saadet Party, and on the one hand you have 2 other leaders who left AK Party. One of them is Ahmet Davutoğlu, he was his foreign chief, and there's Ali Babacan, and he was Erdogan's economy chief. And there is a lot of rivalries within this United 6 or 7, whatever. And now, even before the elections, before the policies which will be applied, the table of 6 started to talk who will get which position, and that was criticized by the public, even among their own supporters. But still, the supporters do not leave to support them, because they want to, Erdogan to unseat. And on the one hand, you have EU Party, a woman leader, very strong woman leader. You have Meral Akşener, and he wants his deputy chairman to be the chief of economy instead of Ali Babacan. And as we are journalists, we have a lot of gossips from Ankara, and we know what is happening behind the scenes. And we know that Meral Akşener is not going well with Ahmet Davutoğlu and Ali Babacan behind the scenes. And I don't know if the U.S. Public is aware of the details. I don't think so, but Meral Akşener left the table some months ago because of the United 6 did not accept her proposed hopefuls. So she was looking for Mansur Yavaş, the mayor of Ankara, and Ekrem İmamoğlu, the mayor of Istanbul, as the presidential candidate. But Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu was insisting on himself. He was telling he was the leader of the opposition, and he needs to be the candidate. So his party was pushing the rest of the table. Then Meral Akşener decided to leave the United 6, and in these 3 days they were just insulting each other. They were just blaming each other to break the coalition. But at the end of the day, they made a deal and they signed a protocol, and mayors of Istanbul and Ankara were promised to be given the title of deputy presidency. But now the question is, there will be a president in case that he wins, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, plus 7 deputy presidents. We don't know which type of ministers they will have, because there's so many rulers.
This race is probably tighter, Yasin, than any previous race, and many say that it could go to a second round, to a runoff, if neither of the top three reach the 50+1 threshold. What would happen if that's the case? If we wake up tomorrow to a runoff election, what should we expect from the top two in the next until 2 weeks from now when they hold the runoff elections?
I'd like to focus a little bit more on the third candidate. So there was a fourth candidate, he dropped out, so this made things a little bit more complicated than it already was. So in order to win this presidential race, any one person just needs 50% of the vote. So if you take two people and put them into the equation, if you have a 50-50 split, and we have an understanding that this is going to be a tight race, the third candidate has been attracting or gaining some form of popularity over the last few weeks, especially particularly young voters and more so nationalists. Exactly, yes. So this is almost as if it's a new wave or new form of Turkish politics. There will be people that will support this candidate, although many people do know and understand that there's a very, very, very, very high chance that he will not win this election. But if he gets the support that he needs, or at least his supporters want that to happen, then he will have a place in government, he will be in parliament, and he could potentially be one of the very few names that could run for office in this next round of elections. However, coming back to what we are discussing here today, we have a 50-50 split. Assuming either one of these two parties, I think, could get roughly 54%. If Sinan Oğan, the third candidate, could get anywhere from 3 to 5%, he could make this split run off to another round of elections 2 weeks from now. So that likelihood is also high. But the reality is the people, they just want this to be done. They want this to be over. At one point, many people would argue that at this point, we really don't care who comes into power because we don't really have much of a decision. We don't have many options. So whatever the case, one party or one leader is offering something good, some not so good, and the other vice versa. That regardless of the situation, we can at least start planning for the next 5 years, and then hopefully then we can start talking politics. But there is a risk that is involved as well. If the opposition does win, the Turkish Republic has a history, especially prior to Erdogan's rule over the country, of changing government once every maybe year and a half, 2 years. So governments never really completed their terms. One of the main reasons are the coalitions that have been made over the years. So there's a very similar scenario, so that is threatening as well. There is a very high likelihood that we could see early elections if Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu does win. This is a possibility. It's a probability. It's not
It's not out of question.
It's definitely not. So what I'm trying to really, the picture I'm trying to paint here is, if that happens, could we see Erdogan coming back into power? Or at that point, will this third candidate, Sinan Oğan, gain the support that he needs and rise to power and completely change the course of this country?
A lot of exciting stories to cover. That's what makes our job as journalists extremely exciting, very exciting. It's nice to have the insight from colleagues, from journalists covering these elections. The elections still ongoing, regardless of the outcome. Turkey has a date with a probably different path, different future that will be determined by the people who are voting today. In Istanbul, Turkey, Mohammed Al Qasim reporting for the Media Line.